So I thought we should begin with a little acknowledgement of the virtue and perpetual love and happiness surrounded by Microsoft. So I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation here. So I've been struggling these past months to figure out whether what we're talking about is a huge idea or a tiny idea. Whether it's the sort of idea that is the beginning of what people use the word revolution to refer to, or a modification of extremes, which would be tinier and smaller and less important. And I want to talk this morning as if it's both, or pretend it's both, or argue to get you to see that you can see it either as small or big, and I'll start with small and then say something to make it seem big. I wrote a paper which is the core of the argument in the book that Jamie has now very kindly twice referenced in the conference. And I just want to begin by making sure that the core argument of this paper is before us, before I try to say whether we're talking about small ideas or big ideas. And I won't try to characterize my idea as small or big. I'll just use it as an introduction here. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, so yeah. Oh no, Microsoft's your friend. You have to understand. Sorry? Yeah, let me just, because I actually, the only reason I wanted to do this is that, well, I wanted to make fun of Microsoft, but I also actually had some quotes that I wanted you to see. And okay. So we start with two ideas, which are fairly obvious ideas that we want to make sure we're all on the same page about. One is an idea about the nature of resources, and I'm just providing some definitional orientation here. I want to talk about resources as being free or controlled, and by controlled resources I want to refer to either property, or in the sense of private property as a controlled resource, or a resource is controlled in the sense that the Soviet controlled resources when resources were controlled by the state. In either case, the relevant fact is there is an actor who, on potentially subjective grounds, can choose to grant access or not to a particular resource. Then the second idea here is the notion of free resources. And these are resources that are either completely free in the sense nobody attempts to control them, or in the sense that we've described here, are resources within a commons, meaning that the access to the resource is generally granted. This is the sense of that Stallman means when he talks about free in the sense of free speech, not free beer. That even if there's a charge, the charge is not the charge of the subjective property actor, but the charge of neutral access, which might be small. Should be small, of course. If that charge were so high, it could change the essence of what we are talking about as a commons into something like private property. But I just want to think of it as small right now. And the second idea is also familiar to you, the idea that we think of communication systems in layers. And here Yochai's work has been organized around this. We think of a physical, as Yochai calls it, the logical, and a content layer that together form the architecture of any communication system. And then against this picture, we have the idea of the internet, and we can think about the internet broken into these layers, and then we have the following observation about the nature of resources within these layers. The first is that the physical layer here is typically controlled. The machines and the wires are owned by private parties or by the government or by institutions. So they're not free in the sense that anybody has a necessary right to them, but they are controlled as I've described them. The content layer, and here I mean both software and stuff that's served across this network, is both free and controlled. In the sense that I mean free, the open source and free software of the network is free stuff, and much of the content on web pages should be free, not worth much anyway. But there's also, of course, as we've seen by this tyranny of lawsuits, a ton of stuff which is effectively controlled. So there's a mix here between free and controlled. But the claim that is critical to understanding the internet, and the claim that's at the foundation of the argument of the paper, is that we should understand the code layer. I've renamed Yochai's layer into code here for completely self-interested reasons. The code layer here is free, which means it sets up a resource which is equally open to all, and it does that because the original architects of the network embraced a principle called end-to-end design. And what end-to-end here must mean is that intelligence in the networks is placed at the edge or at the ends of the networks, and the network itself remains as simple, or as David Eisenberg calls it, stupid as possible. And the consequence of this, not claiming that this is intended necessarily, but the consequence of this is to produce what we can, I think, accurately call an innovation commons at the code layer, which means because the network can't discriminate, because the network hasn't the power to choose which stuff is allowed and which stuff is not allowed at the original design of the network as an end-to-end network, it creates a resource which is equally open to all to innovate around. And innovation then is not controlled in the sense that I meant controlled resources. It's free, and that's the essence of what I think formed the extraordinary innovation and creativity of the network. That's the first idea. So here's now the sense in which what we might be talking about is very small. So there's this guy, Michael Powell. He's got some famous relatives. He's also head of the FCC. Michael Powell gave a speech on October 25th about broadband technologies. And Michael Powell has some very predictable views about broadband and some interesting views about broadband, and the predictable ones are not the interesting ones. But I want to talk about both views of Michael Powell. So Powell has a view about the physical layer of the network and what it should look like in the future. And Powell's view is we have to liberate the physical layer from heavy-handed regulation. The free market must govern the physical layer, which means for cable and even telecom, we've got to remove the heavy hand of government regulation, which has so far stifled innovation. Now, you might think that's surprising. Thought we were all remarking about the extraordinary explosion of innovation, but no, this has stifled the innovation, and so laissez-faire should govern the physical layer. And we have this is the quote from this speech: when someone advocates regulatory regimes for broadband that look like, smell like, feel like common carriage, scream at them, which is a helpful way to have a conversation about this, but scream at them, tell them you have no idea of the cost at stake. Of course, I say, well, what about the benefit? But no, he's interested in the cost at stake, which he says inhibits innovation. So, with respect to the physical layer, Powell's message is give the property owners perfect control over their property. Don't condition it by limitations imposed by regulators. Then Powell had something interesting to say about the content layer. Powell was trying to explain why content in broadband had not been developed quickly enough. And he says, much of what is holding broadband content back is caused by copyright holders trying to protect their goods in a digitized environment, in other words, perfect reproduction world. Stimulating content creation might involve a re-examination of the copyright laws. Arguably, VCRs would not be widely available today if Universal Studios had won an infringement case in Sony 1984. Now, read this over and over again and recognize what's just happened here. The head of the FCC, this never would have happened in a Democratic administration, right? The head of the FCC has said, maybe it's the perfect control over copyrighted materials that is inhibiting innovation and development in the context of broadband. We might have to re-examine that, limit the extent of control that copyright gives to these owners. And if we re-examined that, that might in fact recreate some kind of innovation here, because as he points out, and we all say over and over again, what would have happened if the Sony Betamax case had been decided differently? 2 days after this, I was on a panel with a guy from Sony, Yair Landau. Sony has a view about broadband. And Sony's view about broadband can be divided between its view about the content layer and the code layer. And its view about broadband and the content layer is Powell is the devil. When I mentioned Powell's name, he went crazy, Landau, on this panel, saying Powell has no respect for intellectual property. He's questioning the protection we give to intellectual property and questioning it because he doesn't understand that we've got to have perfect control of intellectual property. We're going to have absolute, extensive control in order to create the proper incentives for people to invent. So the view of Sony at the content layer is more control at the content layer. But later on in this conversation, we got Landau to talk about what he actually does. So what Landau does at Sony is he's developing technologies to enable it so that you can stream movies to your computer. And they've developed all these special technologies. They pay-per-view movies that you can get on your computer. He loves this idea. He's finding it hard to deploy. As he described one event, he didn't name the names, to my great frustration, but he described one meeting he had with certain cable interests, where after demonstrating the system that would make it so you could stream video to computers, you know, cable companies make lots of money streaming video to television sets. What about to computers? The cable company told Landau, we will shut down broadband before we ever allow this technology on our lines. And Landau's reaction was, this is absurd. They're inhibiting innovation, those cable companies. And what we ought to be doing is finding ways to limit them in their efforts to limit innovation, right? So Landau's view about the physical layer was we needed less control at the physical layer. Right? So put these two guys together, right? Powell at the content layer is less control at the physical layer, more control. Landau at the content layer is more control at the physical layer, less control. Putting them together shows that though they don't yet understand what each other are saying, there's at least a common consensus that too much control over what we call property might inhibit innovation in certain contexts. And the common ground here is that we can get people to see how, we're not against, it's not like Powell's against property, and it's certainly not against Landau is against property, but we can get them to see how perfect protection is inhibiting innovation, and we've got to find ways to limit perfect protection. Now, once you recognize, I mean, it's fun to make fun of the two of them for not seeing the other side and sort of arguing so extremely about the part that they want to increase collection, but once you put them together, that's the sense in which you begin to wonder, is this just a small idea that we're talking about? Is it just this tiny little modification? Don't you see how you really believe property needs to be limited in some sense? And so just understand how, in the sense that you don't get yet, it needs to be limited. There are two consequences to this. One comes from yesterday, where it makes it easy for us to see where we will understand there to be a problem, right? So Carrie Sherman got up yesterday and said all this stuff about how they were in favor of the internet. The internet's great. It's going to do all these wonderful things. Don't you see? We love the internet. And then as a throwaway, sort of 3/4 of the way through what he said, quote, you can't expect the labels to cannibalize their business. Which is why Yochai responded, exactly right. You can't expect them to cannibalize their business. Therefore, we need to cannibalize their business. Progress is all about old industries being cannibalized, and the question is, what's the quickest way to cannibalize here? So you can't trust them to do it. That's why we need to liberate the market to do it on its own. So that's the sense in which, for completely obvious reasons that Powell and Landau together should get in some sense, we have progress on what the future should hold, and that is, let's just make sure that the dinosaurs are not able to stop evolution towards mammals, right? We stop the power of the dinosaurs from stopping evolution. And I think what follows from that is the part of this debate where I am getting increasingly less popular about this, but the part that says, if that's all we're doing, let's resist talking about this in ways that sound traditionally left and right. Because the great opportunity here is that we can get people to see our points without them thinking that these are just leftist lunatic ideas, right? So the book, I learned my lesson in my first book, which had a last chapter titled What Declan Doesn't Get. The last chapter of this book is titled What Orrin Understands. And of course, Orrin Hatch is a hero in these debates. The two critical issues that have come up in the last 5 years, Microsoft and online music, he's not been some raging loony, at least on our side. But he has been someone who has seen the fundamental importance of balance on both issues and has insisted on skepticism to make sure the old can't take over the new. Okay, that's the sense in which this is just small ideas. Then I want to think about whether there are bigger ideas here. And the more I struggle with these debates and listen to people talk about them, not lawyers, but people, not that we're not people too, but in a very different sense, the more I realize that I think there's a more fundamental blindness at stake here that we've got to begin to find a rhetoric to resist. And this is a blindness about the nature of property and the way property functions in the context of ideas. So I come from California. California is an interestingly divided state. There's a north and there's a south in California. I come from the north, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a place which has flourished because of the free ideas of Silicon Valley. This is not a concept which was limited to the internet. Of course, for a long time, people have been commenting about the fact that creativity in Silicon Valley came from the fact that ideas and content could flow freely between companies. We believe in free ideas. That's what made Silicon Valley great. And we continue to develop technologies and implementations that also rest on free ideas, on the idea of free culture. In the south of California, a different idea reigns. They believe culture can be owned. In the South, they believe that the right to use or deploy culture depends upon you getting the permission of the culture owner, plantation owner, culture owner, plantation owner, culture owner, who decides, and by the fact of the way the market exists now, hoards an extraordinary amount of culture and chooses whether to license it based on whether they like the way you want to use it. Now, of course, they have a rhetoric for defending what they're doing. We're just, trying to make sure that the artists, slaves artists, have the best opportunity to market their ideas. But we can look at this and say, your concept of culture is different from ours. You think culture is owned. We think it should be free. Now, there's an obvious metaphor here and history to draw upon, and that's the idea of the free labor movement. Free labor, free culture. Because though it's taken, extraordinary efforts for us, and especially Richard Stallman and Eben, to go around and say, when I say free, I don't mean zero cost necessarily. I mean just free in the sense of free speech. Nobody in the free labor movement thought that when you said we want free labor, that meant that workers weren't supposed to be paid, right? Everybody got that the free labor movement was about not zero price, but freedom to move about as you choose, limitations on private control over private rights constructed through contract. That was the free labor movement. And the reason for this was not because they hated the idea of markets. You could have labor contracts. You could have 8-hour work days. You should be paid for those things. Well, actually, at that time, you could have 20-hour work days, whatever. But the concept here was enable limitations on these private rights. Now, it's that set of insights that we have to bring to this debate about culture. Culture, too, in exactly that sense, must be free. Not free in the sense of zero price necessarily, or that you get to steal anything you want. No, that's not the world. But limitations on private rights to enable the greatest flourishing of this kind of culture. Now, the reason this is so hard is that though I could in a stylized way divide North and South in California, each of us has the North and the South inside us. Ordinary Americans, all of us, can be flipped from one side to the other without even noticing it. Most Americans think Mickey Mouse should be owned by Disney for the rest of time, never even thinking, well, what about Victor Hugo's estate's complaints that they destroyed the Hunchback of Notre Dame because it was in the public domain and they could take it and do what they wish with it. Right? We have this deep sense of all us believing, in some sense, the politics of the South and of the North. And what's got to happen is we've got to find a way to liberate this discourse from this confusion, to see the virtue in free culture without imagining it that's some lunacy that would say culture is not part of a creative process and can't be produced by both commercial and non-commercial entities. Now, if that's our message, then this does require something of a war. I hope it's a more civil war than the last one, but a war to reconstruct how these aspects of our life, this culture, is thought of, because though in many ways it's an unfair metaphor, and of course what's at stake is radically different, and the last Civil War was serious, if I'm and this one's not, if I want to make the comparison. But for us, what is at stake is a future which would either be a future where creativity is decentralized among lots of people who can participate and transform, or a future where creativity is increasingly concentrated in the hands of actors who, it turns out, never let stuff fall into the public domain ever again. The technologies and the freedom that these technologies enable forces us to make this choice now, and it will require us, outside of this room, to reconstruct how ordinary people think about this thing which we have allowed them to refer to as intellectual property. It is property, sure, for those of us licensed to use that word. But for ordinary people, I think we need to think about the free in that property in the way that we learned and fought and defended the idea of the free in labor. Thank you very much.